Patrick Henningsen, welcome to the Propaganda & Co. podcast.
It's great to be with you.
It's wonderful to have you here. Today, I'd like to introduce you to my audience. We'll talk about your career as well. But before that, I think we'll hop right into the nitty-gritty and get into the topics that a lot of people, I think, want to get to. So, I want to start with October 7th. That's why I'm here. That's why this channel exists. I know you've been doing your work for a very long time prior to October 7th. I'm actually curious to hear, as somebody who has been covering Palestine for 2 decades now, either covering it directly through your journalism or paying attention to it as someone who cares about the cause of the Palestinian people. What were your thoughts on October 7th?
Let's just say I was surprised in how it happened and how dramatic it was from the Palestinian resistance side. I was not surprised that it happened. I was surprised it happened, and I didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime. There's so many people that were just exasperated. Over the summer, what happened in Jenin was just another reminder of how horrific it is. But to see the despondency in terms of the outrage and the so difficult to gather support for the issue, it's very frustrating. You almost think that this issue is just going to die on the vine, and you're not going to see anything change. Nothing's going to move the needle on this issue. And after October 7th, that's changed. And so to me, it's just another very dramatic episode in a long series of episodes going back 80 years. But a lot of people who are, on social media or active in politics, this was the first time they're really having to confront this issue. So for them, history began on October 7th. But for those that have been engaged in the issue for a long time, this is just another sort of maybe an escalation and maybe a big moment in history. But again, it's part of a long series of events. So from that point of view, you can see how polarizing it is and how it's been attached to partisan politics in the U.S. and how it's congealed in that way. It's just because a lot of people have never paid attention to the issue, don't understand it, don't know the history of it. But a lot of people have got a crash course in that now. And you're seeing the student protests right across the U.S. and Europe as well, and how well-informed a lot of the young people are on this issue now. Is another thing that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime.
So you mentioned how, I guess from the resistance perspective or the standpoint, the performance of the resistance, that it was shocking or unlike anything that you've seen. That's how I felt. So I've been covering Palestine, or paying attention to Palestine, I should say, really since 2008 when I was in high school graduating. And I saw every time Israel mowed the grass, so to speak, or mowed the lawn in Gaza. And I've seen, some of what the resistance was capable of in terms of firing rockets. But so as someone who's been paying attention to Palestine, whether, as an activist and organizer, making videos about it, I obviously care about Palestine, but every time there was another flare-up, I would just think, I've seen this before. October 7th, when I saw the imagery, I remember it was like maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, and a friend in the group chat said, "Did you guys see what's happening in Palestine?" Now, I've heard this a million times in the last, 14 years, right? But then when I saw the paragliders in the air, I thought, okay, I've never seen this before. And I started paying more and more attention, and I understood very quickly what the size and scope of the attack was. And I realized right away, this is unlike anything I've ever seen before. From a tactical perspective, if you could comment briefly on what the resistance did and why it has struck so much fear in Israeli society.
I think they made a big statement, on October 7th, and this obviously went right to the core of the whole agreement, the social contract, if you will, in the state of Israel, especially with the current leadership that has, let's say, been in power for the most part of 25 years, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud coalition. The social contract is come to Israel and we'll protect you. This is the safest place on the planet for Jews in the world, and we'll give you settlements. We're building new settlements every day. They advertise them all over in America through charities and the JNF and people like this, these various organizations. So they're constantly marketing Israel as a destination to go and settle and to live. And then the IDF will be there. They have this fantastic intelligence service, this great military. They're omnipotent in terms of knowledge and surveillance and so forth. It's absolutely a safe place. And the Iron Dome is there to repel any rockets from Hezbollah or Hamas and so forth. So all of that was shattered on October 7th. And then it was shattered even more so when the fighting broke out in the northern occupied territories along the South Lebanon border. And you can see these villages emptying out one by one. So now you have a collapse in the Israeli dream. So politically, this has huge ramifications going forward. But just from we had seen, like, over the last couple of years, more coordination between Palestinian resistance groups, whereas before they appeared to be disparate, not as coordinated, maybe not as focused, and you started seeing Israel getting hit over the last 5 years, and especially when operations that the IDF would launch in Gaza. And we saw scenes over the last few years that were new, RPGs attacking Israeli soldiers and vans and so forth. And the attempted incursions by the IDF were repelled or ended badly. So you knew things were ramping up. This was, I think, a great achievement from armed resistance and armed liberation struggle point of view. Now, that's obviously a perspective that's verboten in the West. You can't talk about it in that framework. But this is effectively what it is. It's always been like this. Show me a country that achieved independence, I'll show you an armed liberation struggle. Look at the ANC in South Africa as the example everybody uses. So whether you support Hamas or not, whether you think they're a terrorist organization or they're an armed liberation struggle or not, you cannot argue with what you saw on October 7th. This was a military defeat for the IDF. And that means things will never be the same. So, and much like in 2006 when Hezbollah defeated Israel in that war and were effectively kicked out of South Lebanon, most of it, that was a game changer, I think, in the alignment of, let's say, the distribution of power in the region. And I think equally this was one of those moments. Now, we can talk about the Israeli reaction to this that added a whole nother dimension to it. But, you have to be, I think you have to be agnostic when you're looking at these things, because in the moment, everybody wants to say, Piers Morgan, do you condemn Hamas? That's how the conversation begins in any discourse, any dialogue. But, zoom out, look at this historically, and it's a different conversation. This is an ongoing battle, an ongoing fight against oppression, against colonial occupation, as recognized by multiple UN resolutions. But all of a sudden, everything that happened before October 7th was erased from the frame. And we're meant to, Western mainstream media, Western politics, want to reduce the frame so that history begins on October 7th. And any conversations about what happened before that are irrelevant and will be muted. And you will be harangued if you even try to make those arguments on some of these platforms. That's how it was in the initial emotive reaction to October 7th. The other thing was there's the theory or the idea that Israel let it happen. That's kind of an important idea, because if you adopt that as your main hypothesis, your main thesis, then you basically strip the Palestinian armed resistance of any agency. In other words, and you take away any military achievement in that. So that's an interesting argument. I see people making that. And maybe even if this was true, the further you get away from October 7th, the less relevant that point becomes, because things have taken on a life of their own. Inertia, events have cascaded. way beyond October 7th. And so Israel let it happen. If that's the sort of overriding conspiracy, it doesn't have a lot of utility at this point.
I think it is important to discuss and focus on, though, and I'm very glad that you brought that up. And the reason why is because, like you said earlier, this idea that with the social contract that Israel has, right? Come here, we'll protect you, and our secret intelligence services are omnipotent. We know everything, right? And I think that was shattered on October 7th. To suggest that they knew it would happen and let it happen anyway suggests that they are omnipotent. They knew what would happen, and they're so intelligent they're able to twist it, and in exchange they'll ethnically cleanse Gaza and acquire this land, and they'll achieve this long dream and goal that they've had for however many decades now, to cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. So I think it's actually dangerous, to present it in this way, and I don't think it's correct. I think objectively looking at the situation, many military analysts agree that the IDF walked into, if not a trap, but a quagmire in Gaza, and they have undermined themselves. I think by doing that, they're losing a lot of money. Their soldiers are, committing suicide when they come back. It's having an effect on Israeli society, and I think it's hurt their reputation. We're seeing the resistance get very creative in Gaza, and I think I don't want to suggest that the resistance thought it would go this far and they were willing to sacrifice however many Palestinian lives. I think people don't like considering that. But like you said, show me a liberation, or show me, how did you phrase it? Show me an
independence movement around the world throughout history, and I'll show you an armed liberation struggle.
Exactly.
And this is just, to me, another example of that. It's couched in the, it's funny because the term terrorist group is a political designation, and it's applied by some countries to the Palestinian resistance. There's many different factions in Gaza, resistance factions. The Islamic Jihad, you have the Al-Qassam brigades. That's effectively the military wing of Hamas. You have the PFLP, all these different groups. And so they're acting in concert for some kind of a shared objective or military objective or goal. You have to kind of look at this into kind of in military terms. So yeah, this is one of those moments in history. And if the U.S. designate them as a terrorist organization, and Britain and France, then the conversation then gets stripped out of military analysis and it's into the war on terror bracket. And the war on terror bracket means that you can suspend the normal rule of law. You can suspend the rules of war, at least in the public domain in terms of public sentiment, because we've been trained to believe over the last, since 9/11 especially, that the worst possible thing in the world is Islamic terror, and anything goes in terms of what the response should be to deal with the problem. Even if it's occupying Afghanistan for 20 years, bombing Iraq into the Stone Age, that's all acceptable from a Western point of view to eliminate the problem. And that's exactly the rhetoric that Israel and Israel's supporters have adopted post-October 7th. This is very interesting. If you take Hezbollah, for instance, or Hamas, they're not a proscribed terrorist organization according to every government on the planet. Only certain governments do. With Hezbollah, France, if I'm not mistaken, people can check, they're not proscribed as a terrorist organization. And they're represented in the Lebanese parliament, the political wing, because in a way, France is in a conundrum there, because if they label Hezbollah as a terrorist group, then they'll have to label the French resistance during World War II in Vichy France that were opposing a Nazi German occupation as a terrorist group, if you go by the same logic. So it presents all sorts of problems. And the problem is in the conversation. And we're not allowed to have an objective, analytical conversation by inserting the terrorist framework. It's an emotive conversation, and it's do or die, basically. And it becomes a zero-sum game at that point. That's the difference. And it is important. And I know that a lot of talk show hosts immediately come out, terrorist attack on October 7th, a terrorist group, and so forth. The U.S. government certainly uses that language. And it means that you don't have to analyze anything. You don't even have to look at the causes of what got you to that moment in history, because everything gets expunged from the past, and it's all about fighting terrorism. And if that means collateral damage is going to be incurred with civilians, then so be it. That's kind of where we're at right now on this conversation globally.
I want to talk about free speech a little later. I know that you have a lot to say about that. But it's interesting, quickly, I just want to point out, you were talking about the way, they frame the conversation and they box you in. History started on October 7th. You're not allowed to provide context. And this isn't just taking place on like the Piers Morgan talk show or on CNN or mainstream media, but it's happening on social media in general. For example, Meta has been notorious for striking down, pro-Palestine content. If you talk about Palestine in the context of humanitarian aid, they'll let you post about it. My account was deleted 3 times and returned to me 4 times. So I'm on Instagram now, but I've learned my lesson. I cannot provide context for October 7th, and there's certain Israeli propaganda I'm not allowed to debunk. If I put out a video talking about mass rape and the hoax there, they will strike that video down. If I provide context, hey, here's why the resistance carried out this attack, they don't consider context as being educational or informative. They consider it as supporting terrorism. And so they've eliminated the ability to talk about, how can you help people understand that history didn't start on October 7th? This is what the world was like for Palestinians prior, and this is, regardless of whether you support what the resistance did on October 7th, doesn't matter. It's just like, here's why it happened, here's what they were thinking, which is helpful for people to understand, I think. But they have stripped, our ability to even discuss that. So I'm glad that you talked about the way they're framing the conversation. So,
and I might add, it's exactly the way that the conversation is framed with regards to Ukraine and Russia. That history began on February 25th, 2022. Putin woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided to invade Ukraine just because he felt like it, and to reconstitute the glory of the former Russian Empire. That's literally the talking points adopted by Western mainstream media and the whole of the political class in the U.S. and the EU. And they don't want to tell you about the shelling of civilians in Donbass 8-9 years before, the fact that there's a Minsk peace process that was on the table, that was even ratified effectively by the UN Security Council. They had a mandate for this, and all of that basically was thrown out the window. So it's the same thing. The frame gets reduced, so no context allowed, and they decide how the narrative is going to go. They decide when history begins. And this is so Orwellian. And then they enforce that on Wikipedia. They enforce that on Meta. They enforce that on Google, YouTube, to some degree, although there's a little bit more speech allowed on that. But there's so many examples of this as well. 9/11 is a good example, is another example of that. Take any conflict, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the latest in a gestalt of events that cause and effect. And if we don't understand, and we can't speak about, we can't analyze, we can't debate cause and effect and context, then we can't learn anything. So how can we make policy that makes sense? We can't. And they're not having those debates at the political level, at the policy level. The people who are formulating foreign policy or the reactions to what's happening in the world, they're not having that discussion. The press isn't having it, so the people aren't going to have it. So where are we at that point? How well are we doing as a kind of democracy at that point?
I want to come back to October 7th if we can. How has October 7th, in your view, changed the political landscape in the Middle East and the world?
I think the Israeli reaction to October 7th, and we can debate about what actually happened about October 7th. That's just another discussion, and a very important discussion, essential discussion, which I know is a big part of your work, and we could talk about that. But the reaction by Israel, the completely over the top they chose to kind of annihilate Gaza and the people in it and justify that for the various reasons that they've said. It has changed for the region. It's brought together, I think, the axis of resistance countries. So for those people who might not be familiar with that concept, it's the axis of resistance comprises of, first and foremost, the Palestinian resistance, then Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a semi-state actor. It's not a non-state actor, it's a semi-state actor. The Syrian Arab Republic and everything within that country, the Iraqi Islamic resistance, the Hashd al-Shabi, the People's Mobilization Units in Iraq, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis, as the Westerners call them, in Yemen. And I might have left out one, possibly an actor there, but that's effectively the axis of resistance. It's brought it together with a common purpose, a common objective now, and an urgency to stop what is an ongoing genocide in Gaza. Now, the best vanguard of the axis of resistance, the country that's enforcing international law within the axis of resistance, the best example of that is Ansar Allah in Yemen. They're basically announcing sanctions against Israel, and they're enforcing them on the high seas in exactly the same way the United States would and Britain have done, seizing Iranian oil tankers, but with a stronger case, because the case they're acting on is in the international courts of justice. So they're trying to enforce international law. One of the poorest countries in the world, Yemen, or at least part of Yemen, under the control of Ansar Allah, they're using what resources they have to basically interdict Israeli shipping or anybody providing material support to the state of Israel. I mean, this is extraordinary. No one's ever stepped up and done what the U.S. have done in terms of backing up sanctions with hard power. And here it is. So that is a game changer. April 14th, when Iran struck missiles and drones, the attack hitting Israeli targets, that is a major game changer. That's the biggest, in my opinion, that's the biggest realignment in Middle Eastern politics and distribution of power in the Middle East and globally, maybe, since Russia intervened in the Syrian conflict in October 2015 and transformed the dynamics of power in the region. Because all of a sudden, before all major decisions had to go through Washington, now they have to also go through Moscow, they have to go through Tehran. And I think Iran had established itself as a regional, maybe the premier regional hegemon as a result of what they did. And the fact that there was no real retaliation from Israel. But that's not the first time that happened. When after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes in Iraq, Iran waited, and then they hit U.S. bases and facilities and just leveled the I think it's the Al-Assad military base in Iraq. The U.S. didn't respond. That was under a Trump administration. They didn't respond. How could they respond? What could they do? That was in, I believe, 2020, January 2020. They couldn't respond. Why? Because Iran has a strategic advantage through missile technology and advances in their missile programs. They also hit targets in ISIS targets in Deir ez-Zor a few years before that, and also targets in Idlib as well in Syria. So they've demonstrated that they can reach that distance and that the U.S. will not respond. And this has happened 4 times if you count the downing of a U.S. Global Hawk drone by Iranian air defenses. U.S. didn't respond. What can the U.S. do? Now we realize the U.S. does not have any strategic strong footing in the region anymore because another country has risen that has the ability to hit U.S. targets. And then the U.S. has to make a calculation. Do we want to lose all of our footprint in the region by confronting Iran and escalating? Or do we want to preserve what we have and then wait and reconfigure later? And they've chose the latter. So, and this is a direct result of what's happened after October 7th. Not only that, that's not even to say about the global support for the Palestinian cause that goes as far as Beijing, that used to be agnostic on this issue. And this is interesting because people thought, oh, the Chinese are immoral. They don't care about the suffering of anybody in the world. They just care about business. That trope has been shattered after October 7th. So those are just a few examples of how things have changed, and they're not the only ones either. Probably the biggest thing that's changed is if you look at Israeli influence and power in the world, Israel's greatest weapon is not its military. It's not much like America. It's not necessarily its military. It's not its financial prowess. It has a great tech sector and the defense sector. It's soft power. It's the Israeli story. It's the fact that enough people in the world are sympathetic to the Israeli narrative and the Israeli story. So what Israel has done by its reaction, its overreaction on October 7th, it sacrificed its most valuable long-term strategic asset, and that is its soft power, its story. Its story as a victim nation that has been shattered because of its over-the-top, incredible, outrageous, violent war of annihilation against the Palestinian people in Gaza. They sacrificed their best asset for short-term tactical, or you could even say strategic gain. That, to me, is an extraordinary moment in history, because it took all of those decades to build that Israeli story, and just like this, it's completely shattered. And nobody will ever look at this country the same again as a result of the horror and the daily diet of horrific images that people have been forced to look at that are coming out of Gaza. And that is something that a lot of people they could never have seen that coming, but it's happened, and at a huge price for the Palestinian people, of course. They bear the biggest price for this in human terms, but Israel has paid a huge price for their actions going forward. That this brings into question the legitimacy of the Israeli state, of the Israeli settler colonial project as it was, formed in the 1940s. It brings it all into question.
I think for me, domestically here in America, we've seen a major shift after October 7th. And I think we're seeing it partly because of the America First movement, but also just in general, I think, in the conservative population of America, there is finally a discussion over Israel's influence. And it's fierce on X. You don't see it on other places, but you see it on X. And for me, I think that's significant because I think what has happened after October 7th is the Zionist lobby, which essentially is an extension of Israel, has revealed how much power they have. And you can't challenge power if you don't know who has it. And for us, because we've been paying attention for so long, we know who has power. And we know how they use that power to silence people, to get them canceled, to completely protect Israel and its war crimes from criticism, from exposure. And that has been flipped on its head now. And people are finally waking up and they're paying attention and they're saying, why are these congressmen and women like zombies just repeating what AIPAC is telling them to do? And now under all these tweets from these congressmen and women, you're seeing average white conservative Americans post a picture, a screenshot of AIPAC, how much money AIPAC has given this specific candidate. So Marco Rubio says something, $587,000. That's why you're talking about Israel. And that has finally been revealed and exposed. And to me, that's significant because 10 years ago, we saw the liberal left, I guess you could say the Democrats, not really the left, but you know what I mean. The Democratic Party, there was a huge shift where the Israelis lost many supporters from the Democratic Party, especially the youth, the millennials, and the generations that come after. And I think the Zionists understood that they've lost those populations and they're not going to get them back, but at least they still had the majority of conservatives on the right, and they were not going to lose them. They lost them, I feel like, this time. That rift has been created, and that gap is widening bigger and bigger, faster and faster. And we're seeing that with the vitriol towards media platforms like the Daily Wire that they now call the Israeli Wire, and that's been exposed. So for me, that's significant, because I think changing the conversation about America's relationship with Israel within America itself, I think that's crucial. I'd like to ask you this. I've heard you say that Israel's trapped in a death spiral. What do you mean by that?
I mean, the current situation is the current government, the Netanyahu-led coalition. They're locked into a political and military death spiral. If the war stops, if there's a negotiated settlement, then Netanyahu's political career is finished. Not only that, that coalition could be severely damaged. Why? Because the minute you stop a state of emergency, during a state of emergency, everything is suspended. Normal business is suspended. Normal politics are suspended. Why? Because there's a war going on, and everybody needs to be on board, and all resources need to be marshaled, political, cognitive, everything, media, support, everyone's got to be on board and be patriotic, etc. But the minute it stops, what happens? The public the Israeli public in this case will have a moment to pause and think and reflect, even if it's a moment, and a lot of other thoughts are going to come in during that period. This is why there's this active effort by the U.S., by European allies, to prevent any ceasefire, to prevent a negotiated settlement, exactly the same as they're doing in Ukraine, blocking any peace negotiations, talking down, intimidating people, hounding people who are even suggesting it, as John Kirby did many times from the State Department, a Pentagon podium, the White House podium. And why is that? Because the Ukrainian people, like the Israeli people, have a moment to pause and think, how did we get here? This is incredible. This is outrageous. This is a crazy situation. We need to hit the brakes. So they're locked in a death spiral in Tel Aviv because if they stop, they're out of power, and it gives the world a chance to reflect. Common sense could enter the void. If they keep going, the longer they keep going, brutally pounding the native Palestinian population in Gaza and the West Bank, the minute they keep going doing this over and over, then internationally the reputation continues to sink, and it gets solidified. And Netanyahu will be alongside the pantheon of dictators in history. This is where he's going to end up. And I think they live in such a propaganda bubble within Israeli society. They're the last people that are probably going to realize this, that because they're insulated from a lot of the I think a lot of the criticism, unless they travel around the world. And in America, the way it's been, dissent against this protest has been cast as anti-Semitism. This sort of phantom wave of anti-Semitism appeared out of nowhere, and so it's not dissent against Israel committing a genocide and killing 40 or 50,000 Palestinians. It's anti-Semitism. So by adopting that propaganda facade, they've been able to stave off the reckoning that eventually will come. The political or the historical reckoning will eventually come, but in the short term, they've staved it off. But the truth and what's actually happened, the political reality, will eventually hit home. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but over time, it's going to be there. And all they're doing is kicking the can down the road. So they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And sadly, a lot of people in Israeli society support the idea of solving the final solution to the Palestinian problem, which is ethnic cleansing. There's a lot of people that support that, and there's a lot of people that support the military operation that the Israeli forces have undertaken, and they have no problem with the death toll on the Palestinian side. Now, am I speaking for every single Israeli? Probably not, but enough people support that, because if they didn't, this government wouldn't be doing what they're doing right now. So this is a tragic situation. You know, they might think they're surviving in the short term, but long term, they're really kind of the whole idea of Israel as a viable state, or as a concept, as a polity, it's sinking. It's not the first time in history this has happened. That there have been failed states in the history of the world, many failed states, and the first trigger for a failed state is when you enact an apartheid system, or you start treating people differently based on their ethnicity, their race, their religion. That's the beginning of a failed state. The same thing happened in Ukraine. They're trying to separate Russian speakers from Ukrainian speakers. That's really, and the U.S. was backing those divisions, just like the U.S. was, and Israel too, have an interest in, you know, driving a wedge between Sunnis and Shiites, in Iraq especially. That was a strategy by U.S. intelligence, by the U.S. military. Clearly that was a strategy, and same in Central America. You have the same sort of ideological wedges being driven during the dirty wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and I could go on and on. But those are the beginnings of failed states at that point. And Ukraine is effectively, has become almost a failed state as a result of this. So whether it's tribal, ethnic, ideological divisions, this is what happens when the government takes that path. And they've taken that path. So they can't, I don't think they can come back from that. And it's going to be a very, very rough road ahead.
Now, I don't want to be pessimistic, but there is something unique about Israel and the Zionist project. A lot of people compare Israel to South Africa, and they draw parallels, but there is a difference, and it's not just the demographics of the population. It is also, I think, the fact that the Zionist lobby is so influential. Like, why is the Zionist lobby able to get away with so much in the United States? It's because of the way that they have mastered the electoral system. They know how to get you elected. They know how to get you kicked out of office. No one is better in this country when it comes to lobbying. I don't even think the fossil fuel industry can compete. The Zionists are the best. They own the politicians. So I don't want to be pessimistic and suggest that if there's anyone who can get away with such a crime and keep kicking this can down the road, so to speak, it would be the state of Israel. What do you think about that?
In terms of U.S. support, I think you're right. In terms of global support, they have turned a dark corner, and they will never recover from this, ever. There's nothing they can do to recover. So that's, I think, the die has been cast internationally. Within the U.S., I think it's only a question of time before this lobby collapses under the weight of its own, I don't know, over-egging the omelet to a degree that has just become ridiculous. And the amount of money behind it, which you rightly point out, is it's funny. They have to spend, I probably have to spend more money on Democrats than Republicans, but not in recent years, no. And so how did they control the uniparty? There used to be more of a pro-Palestinian, I think, sentiment on the left. But when the Democratic Party sort of shed its class consciousness and became an elite neoliberal party, then at that point it became indistinguishable from Republicans. Just on the Republican, on the right side, or the so-called conservative side, you have the Christian Zionist evangelical component. That's very strong, and that solidifies the lobby's power on the right. But it's funny, if you look at the military funding bill that was rushed through Congress, there's pretty much a whip line vote on the Democrat side. So there's no dissenters for money for Israel and Ukraine. But on the Republican side, there were. dissenters. So you have actually more opposition on the right. Traditionally, it was George Bush Sr. He censured the Israeli leadership during his presidency. Ronald Reagan did the same.
Why did they do that?
Well, for Lebanon, in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan basically read the Riot Act to Israel. That was regarded as the father of modern conservatism. George Bush Sr. Similarly was the most tough, probably, in terms of negotiations or criticizing Israel, putting the brakes on things that it was doing. George Bush Jr., even George W. Bush, with regards to Ariel Sharon, the settlement issue. But in recent years, and Obama to some degree, at least rhetorically, not policy-wise, but in recent years now, between Biden, Trump, there's almost no difference. This idea that Joe Biden isn't good for Israel after what we've seen over the last 7 months, he's given Israel more than any other U.S. president in history. The fact that he's made noises about hitting the brakes after 7 months, and the worst horror that the world has ever witnessed in the modern era in such a short space of time, is laughable as a talking point. They say Biden's weak, he's not supporting Israel, he's an enemy of Israel. So it becomes a partisan election year talking point of brinksmanship. It's ridiculous. So you have a uniparty. The lobby will primary Thomas Massie, for instance. They're saying, we're going to primary you, we're going to fund your opposition, we'll go after you because you are not on board with our agenda. So that's a foreign lobby in the United States, basically, going after congressmen or senators, trying to actively get them out of office because they're not supporting their issue, which is a foreign issue. I mean, that's incredible. This is election interference. Just the money alone, the sums of money we're talking about, that's election interference on a incredible level. This is the thing that they accused Russia of doing in the 2016 election, but couldn't come up with any actual evidence to prove it. Here you have a open and shut, clear-cut case of not just massive interference, but literally a wag the dog scenario, where this tail is absolutely wagging the global hegemon, Washington, to the point where it's now demanding total support right across the board, and anybody who's not going to support Israel, they're going to take them down and ruin their political career. I mean, this is incredible. Imagine any other country doing that in Washington. And it's acceptable. They're trying to pass legislation to defund Congress, the latest one, trying to float a bill to defund the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Pentagon. If Biden doesn't promise to give Israel everything it needs in perpetuity forever. I mean, unbelievable. But this is where we're at politically. So there's a lot of fear, I think. People are, you could say it's intimidation. I'm going to call it political racketeering, because that's what it is. It's racketeering on a very international level with hundreds of millions of dollars in slush funds. And we're starting to see the results of it. U.S. is backing Israel in a losing gambit against its own interests, against U.S. interests, against its own foreign policy interests, against the wishes of some of its allies. It's ostracizing and will ultimately further isolate the United States at a time when it cannot afford not to have as many allies. When you look at an empire that's in decline, this is when the empire needs allies more than ever. And the U.S. is shunning and even attacking in some cases its allies, or threatening them with sanctions. I mean, this is unbelievable. They're making all the wrong moves at a time when their power is slightly in decline. And Israel's effectively dragging the U.S. down with it on this issue. And that's how a lot of people are looking at it. You could say the same for Britain as well. They're dragging their reputation down, but especially the United States. Because overwhelmingly, if you look at the UN General Assembly, you look at even the vote to recognize Palestine as a UN member, the world overwhelmingly supports the Palestinian side. But the U.S. and its allies don't. But they don't represent the world. And that's a problem. We still live in a globalized economy. We live in a globalized political international system. You can't throw up this level of barriers between political, diplomatic barriers, and that's exactly what's happening as a result of Israel and having to back it 100% without any qualification.
I know it's very hard to do so, but I would like your prediction. How and when does the invasion and genocide of Gaza come to an end?
That's a really difficult one. I look at it like this. If Israel cannot apply the brakes themselves under their own steam, and it doesn't look like they can, then that leaves only a few other options. One of them is that the United States or a more powerful country will finally impose a political settlement or impose their will on Israel to pause and to stop. Okay, that might happen. We've seen noises to that effect of recently Biden saying we're going to halt arms shipments if they invade Rafah, for instance. All sorts of caveats with that. But let's say that doesn't happen. Then the other option is, and the other scenario is, if other countries in the region move in to forcibly stop Israel by attacking it militarily from multiple angles and depleting its resources, tying it up, and forcing the U.S. to decide whether they want to escalate to almost a World War III situation that would involve Iran and Iran's allies, maybe Russia and other countries, or do they want to avoid that altogether and literally just put a stop to what is an ongoing genocide in Gaza? So those are, some are more likely than others, and some of those are horrific. World War III is a horrific escalating scenario. So, but that's the only thing that's going to stop it. It doesn't look like Israel's prepared to stop. I think Israeli society, the hard right in Israel, the radical extremist coalition, they see the finish line of, they want Netanyahu's legacy. He said, I want to be the one who has won Gaza for the state of Israel. That's how he's saying it. In their mind, they're so close. They're so close.
Do you think he sees himself as a king of the Jews?
I don't, but I think he sees himself as a significant historical figure in the Jewish or the Israeli story. And he definitely wants to be remembered with a powerful legacy that he delivered, like Ben-Gurion or Golda Meir. He wants to be in that sort of, regarded in that, have airports named after him and so forth. Definitely there is, I think, a little bit of megalomania at play there, because he's working against the interests of his own state, his own government. It can't be in their long-term interest. I mean, they have really kind of surpassed the point of no return. So
do you think they understand that?
I think throughout history you see these lapses of judgment, the megalomania, the doubling down. So once you pass a certain threshold, to stop or to reverse is considered defeat, and will be your personal political defeat. And it's happened many times in history. People carry on to keep the story going, and in the end they destroy themselves, their government, and the entire country.
Let me ask you this. Will there be a Palestinian state? And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because it's evolved over the years. I think when we had this conversation 20 years ago, during the Oslo Accords and negotiations, a two-state solution was seen as, to 67 borders, even less than that, was seen as a viable alternative. Over the years, it's become evident to everybody that there is no viable two-state solution. because realistically, Israel will never give up control over the roads, the security roads, effectively a web of, Bantustans. They're not going to allow an airport, any kind of standing military, maybe not even a working port, maybe not even porous borders. They'll still want control over the security of the Palestinian territories. So there is no state, a sort of collection of patches of land, Gaza and bits and pieces of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. That's not a state. And it's not sovereign if it doesn't have control over its water, electricity, its airspace, its telecommunications. It's not able to defend itself. It's not a state. So it just becomes a sort of an occupied and everything but name an occupied territory. So, but more people are, even the hard left, are now talking about a one-state solution. They're saying, well, the future is a one-state solution. We're seeing more talk of this over time. I think it's a generational thing. It's the same in Ireland. The unification of Ireland out of the question 20 years ago, because that generation, there's too much bad blood. There's just too many things attached to the past. As the boomers cycle out of the story and Gen Z comes in, they don't have that natural animus or dislike or, vengeful ideas between the north and the south of Ireland. They're more amicable to a united Ireland. I think the same in the Middle East. I think over time, more people will see the benefit of a one-state solution. That's just my personal view, because the other one is a non-starter. A two-state solution is a non-starter. What shape that takes, what it's called, that's up for the people in the region to decide. What Palestinians want is for Palestinians to decide, not the United States. They tried that before.
But is it really up to the Palestinians?
It's not, but it should be. It should be. And so then that brings us to the other key point. What are our values in the West? Do we believe in self-determination? Do we believe in sovereignty? Do we believe in equal rights? Do we believe in one state, everybody treated equally under the law with a Bill of Rights and maybe a constitution? We certainly espouse that in America. We export that vociferously, and we do it at the barrel of a gun sometimes, even though that's not exactly what we're exporting. But we certainly talk about this. Those are our first principles. So if we wouldn't accept anything less in America, why would we accept something like an apartheid system, or worse, a violent, oppressive apartheid system in the Middle East from our greatest ally? Why is that okay for the region, but not okay here? Certainly we should be advocating what we have in the Middle East, whatever shape that takes. But the current situation, what we're supporting there, which is an ethno-nationalist exclusionary state of Israel, and then this sort of reservation system for the native Palestinian population, you could argue that this even still exists here in America, but not to get into the Native American conversation, that's an interesting debate. But so what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander in that respect. And that level of hypocrisy is becoming now recognized by a lot of people in the world. And again, this undercuts the U.S. legitimacy in terms of its rhetoric and its soft power. Its message is now being undercut by its own policies and actions. And you can blame this issue and their support for Israel for a large part of that right now.
Transitioning now. We talked briefly about the axis of resistance, but I know there's a lot to talk about with Russia-Ukraine, so I think I'd like to transition to Russia-Ukraine if we can. So I want to talk to you about how insane this war is. I describe it as such because normally if there were a war like this, we would view it as just another proxy war, which is tragic, right? But it would not be surprising. The military-industrial complex, this is how they make their money. In some ways, I guess the U.S. can advance their own interests, but most of the time it's usually just profit. And we've seen that in all parts of the world. But the reason why I describe the Russia-Ukraine war as insane, and I'm sure you and many others would as well, is because this is a proxy war on the border of a nuclear-powered nation that once was a superpower, is now a major power, and could be potentially returning to some level of superpower status. And they have the most nuclear weapons, the most sophisticated nuclear weapons, and even if they had 50% of the capabilities they have in terms of nuclear weapons, they could produce an Armageddon on Earth. And so I want to ask you, in your view, what is Russia-Ukraine really about?
The Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's an old story. And some would say, well, this goes right back to the end of the Second World War, and certainly we can start the analysis from there. But in reality, this goes back even further. This goes back 300, maybe 400 years. This goes back to, we can take this story as far back as you'd like, but let's just start with the British Empire and its rivalry with the Russian Empire.
I hate to pause you for a second, but is this the Vladimir Putin, Tucker Carlson type of response?
No.
We go way back in time. I'm all for it. I just think
mine,
it's funny. I feel like we're kind of mirroring that a little bit.
No. There's a thing called the Great Game.
Okay.
And so Britain fought the Crimean War in the mid-1900s, and this controlling the east-west trade route, or preventing an overland trade route. Why? Because Britain was the merchant navy power of the world. So that made sense. Not only that, but separating Russia from Germany, or you can't have good relations, because the moment with its landmass that Russia becomes allied to the industrial superpower of Europe, that changes the whole global dynamics in terms of economics.
It is very interesting that you bring this up, because this is something I wanted to get. This was part of my follow-up question. So I'm sorry to interrupt, because I want to hear more about what you're going to say about this. But you're talking about the relationship between Russia and Germany in the modern context, correct?
Yeah, in the last 200 years.
Oh, last 200 years.
Yeah.
So. Okay. So then, continue. Sorry for the interruption. I'll make my point in a bit. But.
So that's it's always been about that for the British Empire to maintain their hegemony, and then when they passed the baton to the United States, post Second World War. This became, again, this imperative. So from Halford Mackinder, the great British geographer, and the world island theory, who controls the world island controls the world, and then passed on to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is one of the preeminent national security thinkers, a trilateralist post-World War II, to continue that, which is to divide Asia from Europe. You cannot have synergy, because why? Then the geopolitical center of gravity and the economic center of gravity shifts eastward. And what does that do? That cuts the United States out of its control of Europe and European affairs. And if you look at what happened after the Second World War, the United States has always regarded Ukraine as the vulnerable underbelly of the Soviet Union. So a lot of their resources, they kept stay-behind operations. They supported former SS and Nazi militant groups in that country, politically in Poland as well as in Ukraine, Western Ukraine. They've always seen that as a potential weak point for the Soviet Union, geostrategically. And so when they established NATO after the Second World War, NATO allowed the United States full control over European political, economic, and military affairs. And that amorphous organization, NATO, led by the U.S. and Britain, it's the two dominant members, and everybody else is really a junior partner or an insignificant partner in that organization. If it was a European collective defense, where would the U.S. be? Kind of out of the picture. in terms of defense procurement and in terms of dominating the agenda for Europe. Look at what happened since the Ukraine war kicked off. The U.S. is now dominating Europe. NATO is the #1 organization. They're dictating economic policy. They can dictate the U.S. who you trade, who you buy oil from, who you buy gas from. They can determine your economic bottom line. So what's happened is, because of this latest phase in the Ukraine conflict, starting on February 25th, 2022, you've seen the European economy come down a notch as a result. And German industry fleeing Germany. Germany is now in one of the weakest points it's been since the Second World War. And that is a radical shift in
such a short amount of time.
Like this, because of sanctions and other policies and backing this proxy war. This is incredible. So that's the engine of Europe. Is now in a deflated economic position. Europe is now energy dependent more than ever from the United States and LNG coming over. So the U.S. control and are profiting from this crisis more than ever. It's not just about profits, it's about control. And so again, you see what they've done. The center of gravity is not towards Moscow, it's back towards Washington.
Yes.
And so the European Union has been taken down a few notches and taught a lesson by the U.S. and the British. And as the British withdrew from the EU, very timely, just before this, the hostilities in Ukraine ramped up to a big level. It's interesting how...
Yeah, this is a very unique perspective, and I don't hear this enough. I listen to Mearsheimer, I listen to Jeffrey Sachs, Scott Ritter. I haven't spoken to Mearsheimer or Sachs yet, but the idea from their perspective is that this runs counter to U.S. interests. But actually, I think you've made a very good argument, and I don't know if I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you confirm for me if I'm understanding you correctly, but you've made a very good argument for why this war actually does make sense for the United States geopolitically in terms of their strategic interests, because it's not just for the military-industrial complex. It sounds like on a global level there are real consequences to allowing this overland route as you described, and the way I view it, that this was more about Germany and Russia than it was Ukraine and Russia.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so I'm very glad that you're actually
look at it this way: the Nord Stream pipeline, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. A lot of people will look at that situation and they'll say, the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. Let's say it's by NATO or NATO members. Let's say it's the U.S. That's a reaction to Russia's special military operation or invasion of Ukraine. But reverse that logic. Look at it the other way. That the war in Ukraine and baiting Russia into that situation, arming Ukraine to NATO standard all those years, building up a Tet offensive that was about to take place right before Russia intervened, that was a reaction to the construction of the Nord Stream pipeline.
Right, which Donald Trump tried very hard to convince the Germans, don't do this, you're putting us in a very, well,
he's saying that you're going to be held hostage by the Russians. Of course, that was just rhetoric. The opposite's true.
Right.
They're being held hostage by the United States, literally, and the U.S. is arguably involved in a major attack on a European infrastructure, energy infrastructure, unprecedented in history. But that's the sort of dire position that we are at in the world right now and geopolitically. And this is why a lot of people are really frightened by how things have escalated as a result of the situation. They tried to disrupt Russian gas supplies into Europe through Ukraine, and arguably this was also part of the instability there post-Maidan as well. And Russia just basically did a deal with Germany to bypass that problem over land by Nord Stream. And it was a great thing for the German economy. They could guarantee and lock in gas prices. Good for their industry, good for BASF, Volkswagen, Siemens. These companies...
And good for the climate even. Or better than oil, because it's 50% cleaner, right? And that was the entire point.
That was the entire... Exactly.
Well, most of the point.
Natural gas ticked those boxes for the green compliance. So, good point. But those industries have fled Germany now. They've gone to China, they've gone to the United States, and they're never coming back. So what is the future of Europe as a result. They're going to become more dependent on the United States, on U.S. Financial bailouts, on the IMF, maybe one day, who knows. But they will not let them trade and do business with Russia.
Yes, I'm very glad to hear that I'm not one of the only people, and there maybe this is said by others. I haven't seen it, I haven't come across it, but this is something I've been thinking about. So, in hearing you articulate it much better than I could have, I think is kind of exciting for me, because I've been thinking about this, especially in the context of like the multipolar transition, right? If the U.S. understands that the world is changing and China's rising, then from their perspective, it's better to lock in their customers, so to speak, right? Their state, the states that they view as satellite states or customers, right? It's better to lock that in. And so moving forward, they made sure, no, the Germans are with us. The Russians, you don't cross this territory. Poland belongs to us. Germany belongs to us. Western Europe belongs to us. They will take liquefied natural gas from us, even though it's more expensive, even though they have to invest in these new terminals and they have to pay these exorbitant shipping costs. They will get it from us. Qatar also benefited a lot because now they've struck a deal with Germany, I think, for the next 20 years. But for the most part, it's U.S. companies that are benefiting. And so they've locked in. They've said, moving forward, if we are going into a multipolar world, Western Europe, the more sophisticated and developed economies, they're with us, not with you. And not with China as well.
It's like a protection racket. It's like, NATO is functioning like a protection racket. We're going to say, you don't buy from him, buy from us.
Right.
And we'll protect you.
So have you ever seen The Sopranos?
It's basically scale that up geopolitically, and that's what you've got. Think of NATO as the glove in which the United States can insert its hand into European affairs, be they, as I said, military, economic, and political. And not only that, that EU member states cannot have independent foreign policies anymore. This is a big change. They used to have used to be dissent within Europe. France is a good example with the Iraq War and so forth, and was out of NATO for years, came back in just in time for Libya. So this is interesting. So think of it like that. In fact, the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Hastings Ismay, said the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And he said that in, what was it, probably 1954 or something like that.
So they recognized Germany's capabilities as far back, well, obviously because what they did in World War II, but even afterwards they saw still the potential for them to rise as an economic power.
And that's why the U.S. occupied Germany militarily. The troop numbers that the U.S. used to have in Germany, way more than what they have today, in Stuttgart and Ramstein bases, and the largest NSA one of the largest NSA listening stations in Germany as well. But to basically, that was the deal. Germany could not have a national military, and in exchange for this, the U.S. opened up U.S. markets for German businesses and allowed them to rebuild and build up their economy by giving access to the consumer baby boom market in America in the 1950s and 60s. The same with Japan. Can't have a national military, and we'll occupy you militarily, which we still do in Okinawa and other bases in Japan and South Korea, but will give Japan access to U.S. markets, and also Japan will also buy U.S. debt as well and hold debt. One of the largest holders of U.S. debts is Japan. So this helps to shore up the U.S. global reserve currency of the U.S. dollar. So all of these dollar sinks around the world post-World War II and till today help to sustain the U.S. dollar as a world reserve currency. They all contribute, and there's U.S. dollars all around the world in bank accounts of countries. But anyway, that was the deal. So what happens when Germany wants to do its own foreign policy, or Japan wants to be allies with China? Then you have problems. Then you start seeing tensions with Taiwan ramping up. Then you start to see this thing in Ukraine ramping up. So people at the RAND Corporation in Washington made no bones about it. They like to see Russia divided into 10 different small states. And this has always been, this is what the Middle East effectively is. It's a map-making exercise post-World War I that bakes in, and post-British Empire in Asia, for instance, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, India. It bakes in conflict in perpetuity because of the map makers drawing their borders after the empire recedes. And so this is a good part of the instability that we have. Israel is like the ultimate example of the establishment of the State of Israel. It's like eternal conflict in the region.
Right.
It's at war with all of its neighbors practically, and it's holding a gun to their head with nuclear weapons, and the region just has to accept it. And it's been an unmitigated disaster since 1948. Let's be honest, including the Iraq War, which I will lump into that analysis. It's not been good for the region. But show me a colonial settler state that ended well. It's hard to find them. And so anyway, getting off topic there. But
yeah. So coming back to Russia-Ukraine, so it sounds like the Russia-Ukraine war actually is in the U.S. interests, and I think in a strange way, though, both the Russians and the Americans are going to benefit from this war. That the Russians needed to remind the world of their strength. They needed to make these internal changes to their military. They have innovated. Their troops are now battle-hardened. And if we are moving into, God forbid, a scenario in which these powerful states are sending
their economy's been reconfigured.
Their economy's been reconfigured. They're beginning this de-dollarization process, but they weren't able to infuse. They weren't able to pump the German economy, the German machine, with resources, but they are now going to pump the Chinese machine with resources. So the U.S., either way, the Russians are pairing with somebody. It was either Germany, and it would have been in Russia's interest, I think, to be able to work with everyone. But now they're completely cut off from Western Europe, so they don't benefit as much. But I do think those resources that would have went to Germany are now going to go to China. And China I think they have much more industrial capabilities than Germany. And in a similar way, they have navigable rivers in the way that Germany does, and that makes their logistics very, very efficient. And so China is going to benefit a lot. And if you think about the world island, Russia and China together in an alliance already covers maybe 40% of the entire world island, if not more. So they're almost there. And if they can continue to work together, and if the alliance continues and it's fruitful, then you really could see George Mackinder's world island theory.
Halford Mackinder.
Mackinder. Isn't it George Halford Mackinder?
I'm not sure, but
okay.
I know him as Halford Mackinder.
Halford Mackinder. Apologies. Halford Mackinder, his theory about the world island could come to fruition, but it's funny how, and I'd like to get your opinion on that, but last thing I'll say is it's funny how Mackinder's theory, which is quite old at this point, and it's just a theory, it's not really ever been proven, it's been tested, but it's never been proven. It's funny how that theory is still relevant in the minds of these strategists, for these different countries.
Well, I think what's important about the world island theory and Mackinder is it was the British Empire was the first empire to conceptualize the world as one unit, and before that, because parts of the world hadn't been discovered, just a few years before the British Empire. So and they say the sun never set in the British Empire. So it regarded it as one sort of unit and one system. And from that way of conceptualizing the world and how to manage that world came the international system and the system of international relations, including the multilateral institutions like the UN, the WTO, and all of these groups and organizations that came into being post-World War II. It's a legacy of that. So we have an international system, and there's a whole study of international relations that have, arguably two major schools coming out of the West, which is the liberal internationalist school of thinking and the realist school of thinking. When you say John Mearsheimer is a quintessential realist, but that competes with the Barack Obama and Fareed Zakaria of the world and the Henry Kissingers Henry Kissinger was a bit of a hybrid realist and a liberal internationalist, but you have people that still believe that international law and the international organizations, multilateral institutions, we should go by those, and that raw power and state power doesn't doesn't exist or is illegitimate. The realists will say, Ken Waltz, John Mearsheimer, and others will say, no. It's a Hobbesian state of nature at the end of the day, and might does make right when you have an unequal distribution of power. All countries are not created equal. Some have bigger militaries, some have their own oil and gas, others don't. They have to import it. They're dependent. So small states have less sovereignty than big states. Big states can choose when to invoke international law and when to ignore it. And as Mearsheimer famously said many times, especially after the Ukraine conflict broke out, he said, when it comes to a great power having to choose between doing something in their national interest or abiding by the letter of international law, they will always choose what's in their security interests and not by the letter of international law. And that's just a reality. And what are you going to do about it? And that's the realist argument. And you can kick and scream all you want, and you can say the U.S. violated international law by turning Iraq, half of Iraq into a bowl of dust. But who's going to stop them? And if you choose to confront the U.S., you then have to calculate what you're going to have to sacrifice to do that. Ditto with Israel if it has nuclear weapons. Iran can't just say, we're going to pick a fight with Israel until it stops beating on the Palestinians. They have to consider, as a state, as a government, or Lebanon or Syria, what are we going to sacrifice by taking the stand? And the smaller the state, the more calculations they have to do. The bigger the state, they have more gravitas and more natural power. China or the U.S. doesn't need to pick a fight with Israel. They'll just tell them what to do. And that's the end of that. So back full circle to that question about the lobby. They can't tell them what to do because their political system has been captured. And that's nullified the power of the United States in making it act against its own interests. So, and we see this more and more. We see countries acting against their own interests because of undue influence. Ukraine is a good example, completely against its national sovereignty and interests. It's allowed the U.S. to come in and micromanage its government, its military. Basically, every single aspect of Ukrainian society is more or less controlled, funded, or micromanaged by foreign entities. Zero sovereignty left.
Yeah, Ukraine is kind of the grass beneath the elephants, right? What do you think Ukraine should have done?
Well, it depends. If they wanted to preserve their country in terms of their, what their borders were, post-1991 borders, I personally think with regards to Crimea, there's nothing that they can do. Crimea is Russia. It was Russia before 1953 when Khrushchev gifted it to Ukraine for political Soviet politics, basically. There's a whole interesting story behind that. But so when Crimea voted after they saw what was happening, the lustration that was happening in Donetsk and Lugansk and in Kiev, and they said, well, we don't have any part of this. They voted snap referendum, 90+%, join the Russian Federation. They're Russian people for the most part. And so that's Crimea reuniting with Russia. That's one way to look at it. Not Russia annexing Crimea, but reuniting. Not unlike East Germany, reuniting with West Germany after being separated for a similar period of time. Now that would be that's apostasy for me to say that, for sacrilegious for Eurocrats and when they hear someone make that argument. But let's be realistic, it is. They're not coming back. Ukraine then had an opportunity to avoid this conflict by implementing the Minsk peace process. That was on the table, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and everything was done to thwart that effort. And the two European countries that were meant to guarantee that, Germany and France, sandbagged it. Admittedly, Francois Hollande admitted that during the crank phone call with Vovin and Lexis, and Angela Merkel admitted this publicly. Petro Poroshenko admitted it, and Zelensky admitted it. So this is beyond debate. They sabotaged the Minsk Accords to buy time to arm Ukraine to prepare for the war that was coming. They might not have realized that war was coming, but you can be damn sure the United States, those in Washington, London, and Brussels were preparing for it. Otherwise, why would they be pumping so much military aid and support and then amassing Ukrainian troops along the Donbass line of contact? So they had an opportunity to do that. They made every move possible to avoid a peaceful settlement, and it was only a question of time before Russia had to make a choice. Do we allow the people in Donbass to be overrun, or do we call their bluff? And eventually, in February 2022, they called Europe and NATO's bluff, and all hell broke loose. And then the sanctions came, and then now we have a very dangerous situation where they're poking and prodding Russia, supplying weapons, and we are on the precipice, potentially, of a nuclear confrontation. That's where we're at. It could have all been avoided very, very easily, and without Crimea, but
avoided if the Germans decided not to do Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, possibly, but it happened. It's amazing how it happened. I mean, they could have blocked it before it was built, but they didn't. Why is that? Maybe it was because people argue the Obama administration wasn't aggressive enough to prevent that project from happening. Who knows or maybe they wanted it to happen to have this series of events unfold to, I don't know. It's quite an extraordinary series of events. Unbelievable that the audacity of just the Nord Stream alone, just that issue.
Right. Not even including the dam destruction and the entire war. Yeah. It's just been chaos.
Yeah.
So before we pivot from this conversation, I do want to ask you about the state of the war currently. So the U.S. has just injected another $60 billion. It's a lot of money. And they've injected a lot of this cash to the Ukrainians, and they're going to give them more weapons. Now, many argue that it's too little too late. It's not enough. The Russians have ramped up. That's it. Their machine is finally hitting its stride, and they're ready. So now, the other day, they started probing. They were probing actions north of Kharkiv. And so now, I think Zelensky announced he's canceling all trips abroad. He needs to stay in Ukraine because they were really spooked by this. And it seems like, from what I understand, is the Ukrainians were not expecting a Russian advance this soon. And the probing action is a precursor to this advance. And if the Russians do advance, the Ukrainians will have to make a decision. Do we defend Donbass or do we defend Kharkiv? And Kharkiv is the second largest city. And they won't have the ability to say, like they had said with Bakhmut, that this doesn't have any strategic values. Like, it's your second largest city. So what is happening now? Where are we currently? And what do you think is going to happen next?
So this, what we're seeing now is the kind of, I think that the death pangs of the Ukrainian project as a proxy for NATO, a NATO's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And it was only a question of time before, I think, Russia would want to secure the Donbass. And to do that, you have to move beyond the borders of the Donbass. So where are the missiles coming from that are hitting civilians in Donetsk? They're coming from further afield. They're coming from these very regions where they're mounting a counteroffensive. So if the U.S. had the same identical situation and Texas was being shelled, or Arizona is being shelled from Sonora, or further, then the U.S. military would move past that point, even where the missiles are being launched from, and they'd secure it. They'd either eliminate the military threat, and then they'd secure that area as a buffer zone to protect Texas or Arizona or whatever. And this is how any powerful military that's going to exert its national security interests will act. Russia is no exception. What the real strategic, most important strategic place right now in Ukraine isn't necessarily Kharkov. It's actually Odessa. And if Ukraine loses Odessa, it effectively loses its access to the sea.
They're landlocked.
They become a rump state. And the Black Sea reverts to what it was during the Cold War, which is a Russian lake, effectively. And then Russia secures its Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol, and it secures Mariupol and its interests there in these what they call the new regions. Now we will say, yeah, or modern Russia would call them the new regions. In reality, if you look at history and Novorossiya, these are old Russian regions. Ukraine as a country is a relatively new concept. And Putin with Tucker Carlson laid out that whole historical master class. Some will call it, critics will call it a diatribe, some will call it a master class. But that's the story. And like it or not, that's the reality in the region. There's a lot of history in this region that we in the West just dismiss out of hand, we ignore, we scoff off, like World War II history. That parts of, well, Ukraine and parts of Russia were occupied by the Germans right up to Rostov for more than 2 years. And Belarus was occupied for more than 2 years. And they broke the back of the Nazis during World War II and at a high price. So this means nothing to us. And so, but it means everything to people in this region. That is part of their history, as much as the American Revolution is a part of American history. And it's nothing, you can't tamper with the narrative. We in America, we have our national stories and our national narrative. So do Russia. So does people who live in Ukraine during the Soviet times. So Odessa, if they lose it, that's a game over for NATO. It's game over. There's nothing's what
game over for NATO in Ukraine.
I think so, and in Europe.
Why do you say that?
I think Zbigniew Brzezinski, in one of his books in the 2000s, made a statement that without the Ukraine, or without Eastern Ukraine, not to be too specific, but Russia can't be a superpower unless it has control of these areas. Why? Because then it can defend its national security perimeter. Then you can be a world superpower. So that's basically what's at stake. So NATO will do everything possible to prevent that from happening. And they don't want to go back to that situation. They want Russia weak, divided. They want them exposed. They want their naval base exposed so that they can't project power or influence in the Caucasus, for instance, and they're tied up with all these problems that they've created. That's the strategy. So Kharkiv will be a great potential distraction for Ukraine to put reinforcements there. They're going to be depleted in Odessa. So I wouldn't put it past Russia to be acting soon after.
So does that mean you see the Russians crossing the river? What is the name again of this?
Dnieper River.
Not the Dnieper River, but there's a city on the Dnieper River that they retreated from. It's east of Odessa.
East of Odessa. Yeah, there's a number of cities. You're probably talking about Kherson. Kherson on the west side.
Yes. So do you see them crossing the river, retaking Kherson, and going for Odessa?
If Russia crosses the Dnieper River, it's to push back the Ukrainian military in order to secure the Dnieper River, and only for that reason. Certainly, I think it's within Russia's interest to have Kiev as a friendly, neutral capital of what's left of Ukraine. But as a NATO member, I think that's a non-starter. That's just there is no way that Ukraine could even house any jets or any significant, serious military equipment at that point in their country, because it would just be hit by Russian missile strikes or air strikes. It's a non-starter. In the same way, it's that it's funny that the U.S. backs Israel to totally demilitarize Palestinian resistance, and if you consider the threat of having the whole of NATO amassed on your southern border that Russia is facing, and they don't think that Russia has an interest in the demilitarization of Ukraine. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous when you think of it in those terms.
But when you put it in the context of what we were talking about earlier, the interest they have in securing Germany and taking and carving up the rest of Western Europe and keeping them under the control, it seems like a price worth paying, right? You never really had Ukraine to begin with.
It's not only, and so this is getting to the Julian Assange argument, that it's not about winning and losing. It's about perpetuating the system of war as an industry. And if you look at what's happened, if Russia advances to the Dnieper River and Ukraine becomes east, Russian side, west, Ukrainian/European side, that's a win for NATO, because NATO has already pushed the east-west line right up to the Russian border. Poland has been remilitarized.
Yeah.
Finland is militarized. Sweden is militarized. The Arctic is now being militarized. So if the goal is militarization and creating a strategy of tension between Russia and Europe, NATO has already won. And the United States has already won. They've achieved that. That's going to guarantee that there's going to be billions of dollars spent maintaining that, just like the DMZ in South Korea and North Korea. That's a dollar sink in perpetuity, billions and billions of dollars. And so the same with Europe. And the United States has complete influence and control, domination of military equipment, strategy, bases. Nuclear weapons will be moved closer to that line, if not already there in some cases. And so, yeah, for the Western military-industrial complex, if keeping this machine going is the real objective, they've already won. They don't even need a World War III. The tension that's been established now, as a result of the last 2 years, could be played out over the next 50 years to maintain that tension. And think of the trillions of dollars, the troops that are going to be there, the expansion of bases in Romania, etc. It's just going to be the congressmen, senators. We need more missiles in Western Europe to counter the threat from Putin. This is just going to go on and on and on until something happens or doesn't happen, a peace treaty or World War III.
I'd like to transition now to the Middle East again, but I'd like to talk to you about it in the context of your work. So you have done a lot of reporting on the ground in the Middle East. You've been to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you've been to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So what took you to the Middle East? Why were you reporting on the ground?
I was taken there initially firstly to Lebanon, and was just kind of getting started doing independent journalism, blogging, and I had different reasons for being there, partly family, partly because I was just very interested in learning, experiencing more of the region after studying it, writing about it, talking about it. So that was a big learning experience. First, learning about the region, the Lebanese civil war, the Palestinian issue as it's more widely in the Middle East, and also Hezbollah, their story, why that's significant, the truth and the reality of Hezbollah, what they are. And then when the war broke out in Syria, I've been covering it remotely, from a distance, from the West, from Europe, from the U.S., and I had an opportunity to go there in 2017 for about 5 weeks. So it was a good...
Where did you go in Syria?
I went, we landed drove to Damascus from Beirut initially.
So you went to Beirut, drove to Damascus?
Yes, drove a taxi to Damascus.
Yeah.
Is the only way you could get there.
Yeah.
Which is about $60, I think, one way.
Not too bad.
Yeah, I think it was about $60.
It's cheaper than an Uber from the airport. Yeah.
But and then from there, visited Aleppo. Right after East Aleppo was, as the Syrians would say, liberated. But then that was just a completely devastated area. Had a chance to visit that. I was investigating and looking for white helmets evidence and learning more about this phenomenon. We'd been covering this. 21st Century Wire was, I think, one of the first kind of media outlets to put a lot of articles and investigations about the White Helmets, this search and rescue NGO that was backed by all the Western countries to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, providing all the imagery for CNN, the BBC, and Western mainstream media. And that was in 2015. I worked with a good journalist who was writing with us at the time, Vanessa Beeley, and no one else was covering this at the time. We invested a lot of resources into it. And it's funny, afterwards, the mainstream media said this was a Russian disinformation campaign.
But it was you.
It was us. I couldn't get the Russian media to take any interest in it. They were saying, well, we don't really get it or understand it. They didn't really touch it until 2016.
Interesting.
Like a year later.
Yeah.
But we still got it still got blamed as a Russian campaign, and then we got blamed of parroting Russian disinformation.
Yeah, you're like, no, I'm the source of it.
But later, after 2015, I mean, other people started writing about it later. I think the following year, Max Blumenthal
he's done a lot of coverage
wrote a
on
couple
this,
articles, and that helped to really kind of raise awareness. We're a smaller independent media
for those who
outlet.
don't know, the 21st Century is your independent media outlet that you established.
21st Century Wire, 2009.
2009.
Yeah.
Okay.
Started off as a blog site.
Okay.
So it's been a kind of consistent platform. But
Is it just you writing for the platform, or do you have others?
I have a number of other writers who work on a freelance basis.
Nice.
We've had different staff in and out depending on what we can afford. But it's been a challenge, in terms of like censorship, being delisted off organic searches from Google, problems with Google AdSense, problems with ad providers, all the things that people are, dealing with that make your independent platform viable. A lot of those avenues were cut off in 2017 when this major push happened to fight disinformation, and big tech went pretty much on a...
So you became a target.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think you were removed off of Twitter. Is that correct?
Yeah. We were on a number of blacklists, and the blacklist started after Donald Trump was elected. And you started seeing this trend of academics, the University of Washington, Stanford Internet Observatory, and there's other people started coming up with these lists. Operation or Project Owl at Google had a list of blacklisted for search. It's the thing about that, Google has a monopoly, 95, 98% of all searches. So we used to be number one. We were beating mainstream media outlets for like Syrian war, White Helmets, and so forth. After April 2017, we fell completely off. Our traffic, organic searches just disappeared. Our traffic dropped by 70%, as did 200 odd other websites that were also blacklisted. Many of them in the same information alternative space that we were in. Traffic dropped 70%. So ad revenue dropped 70%. So that's how it was done. And a lot of people moved to membership models and other ways to survive after that. And but yeah, that's so we started doing a lot of journalism. It's been a challenge to stay buoyant, but yeah, we're still there. We're still doing some
well, we
good
can
work.
relate. We know what it's like. Barely keeping our heads above water
and getting attacked by the mainstream media, because it's not just an information war. It's also a credibility war. And the first thing that people will do to attack a story is to attack the author or to attack the website, to defame it, to smear it.
Mischaracterize it.
Yeah, so because of what they're covering. So then it becomes a war on credibility. The people will... Organizations, government want to cast you as not a credible source. And so they've created this global disinformation index. It's one of these sort of quangos, international quangos, funded by the U.S. government, funded by the George Soros and other open society outfits and foundations pumping money into these sort of things. But the U.S. government's a big funder of a lot of this. But to act as gatekeepers, to say those websites are peddling disinformation. And so then they can put pressure on advertisers whose products appear on those websites to get them demonetized.
Right.
They can then, through the Twitter files, as you said, I was kicked off Twitter for questioning the vaccine or just bringing up issues on vaccines and COVID, asking questions. I was kicked off, I think, in 2021 when Elon bought the platform, I was a few months later got an email from someone at Twitter, and saying, "Hey, you're allowed to come back, reinstate your account and so forth." So, but then I got a call I got an email, it was a DM, I think, from Matt Taibbi much later, and he said, "Pat, did you know you're in the Twitter files?" And I was like, "Okay, not surprised." And so he showed me where I was in that. So I was already on those blacklists. I don't know if my inclusion in the Twitter files under this sort of Hamilton 68, it's funded by the German Marshall Fund and probably the U.S. State Department, and they used it to tag Russian bots and Russian disinformation. And, they have these really sophisticated departments, like at the University of Washington, led by this person's Kate Starbird, who was on 60 Minutes recently, and they're crusaders fighting disinformation. Alex Stamos, former CTO, I believe, at Facebook, he's at the Stanford Internet Observatory. They scour and they police the internet for disinformation. So, and they map the disinformation on these fancy heat maps using APIs on social media to try to track bad thinking, bad information. They're not mapping disinformation or misinformation. They're mapping dissenting opinion. But they packaged it through this new censorship industrial complex, which really was launched in a big way in 2016 as a response to Russian interference and Donald Trump winning the election, Brexit, and so forth. This is where all the political capital arrived and the financial capital to fund all these various projects. You've got NewsGuard, fronted by heads of intelligence agencies, former heads of the CIA, and so forth. All these are gatekeeping organizations to attack any independent media or thinkers, YouTubers, websites, anybody who is challenging the consensus reality narrative and being cast as peddling disinformation. Disinformation as a word didn't exist before.
It doesn't even make sense as a word if you think about it.
It doesn't. It's a completely ambiguous, arbitrary term. Actually, if you want to trace the genealogy of disinformation, is kind of coined by Joseph Stalin to discredit his political opponents. I mean, you can't make it up.
Yeah.
And these people have erected whole academic departments around this. You're on those lists, I'm sure, that they're studying.
I hope not.
Propaganda and co's peddling disinformation, and all you're doing is basically countering the consensus reality narrative because they had a monopoly on consensus reality through the major networks and the major newspapers.
Yes.
And the explosion of internet websites, social media has created a huge problem because now you can't establish the consensus reality so easily. So you need to attack anybody who is going off script. And they regard people like you and me as easy targets because we're small and we're weak. And who are we? I don't have the backing of any, big institutions or Soros or any of these various foundations that fund billionaires that fund the Koch. The Koch brothers.
Does
for
Putin
instance.
no longer send you money, or?
No, the Putin. I know. It's so funny because I did reporting, volunteer reporting for RT. I did over 200 live segments from the Libyan war right till the Ukraine war began, and I didn't. I was offered, payment, or people said, "Why didn't you get paid for it?" And I purposely didn't want to get paid for those live appearances on RT over a 10-year period. There's a lot of them. And I purposely didn't want to because I didn't want to be accused of being a Russian agent, but I got accused anyway.
Right?
So it's like,
that's why I won't associate. I've had Press TV, TRT reach out to me, and I say, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. And that's why, because I know that it will be used against me one day. So, to undermine the platform, at least.
Yeah, and I wanted to retain the independence of myself, 21st Century Wire, on behalf of our readers and our listeners, and I felt that was important that I didn't do that. But they were a great platform, and I worked with some amazing producers, anchors there behind the scenes, and they never once pre-interviewed me. Not once. Imagine doing 200. I've done live mainstream media segments. They always pre-interview you the night before, and they act like they're your friend.
Do they really?
Oh yeah, and
I've never gone through this process before.
They pitch you softball questions. When Julian Assange was being put in Belmarsh prison, I think it was LBC, London Broadcasters, a mainstream UK outlet. Some producer called me, assistant producer, trying to be really friendly. Oh, so what do you think about this Assange story? Oh, well, yeah. So tell me about this. And they throw you softball questions the night before, and you go away from that pre-interview thinking, wow,
this is gonna be good tomorrow.
This is going to be good. They're on our side. Yeah. They really care about Julian Assange. And then you get on live on the air, and they just go after you. And I just got attacked. And they use the Piers Morgan method, which is to cut you off and to really just frame the argument, almost like a keyhole framing of the argument. They put you right into the corner.
Yes or no.
Yeah, but I was prepared. And I absolutely, because I knew the Swedish sex case with Assange really well. I did a lot of reading and research. I was able to counter his arguments, so much so I was so happy with how this went. And I asked for the recording, and they wouldn't give it to me afterwards. So yeah.
That's why
which not surprisingly.
You got to record yourself always.
Yeah. So
you got to have your phone set up. Anything really, just to protect yourself.
Yeah, I wish I had a live recording of that, but it's interesting. RT never pre-interviewed me. They just said, "Come on, say what you want, and we trust that you're going to give us good information." And I was never directed or anything like that. So I got a lot.
They may not have pre-interviewed you, but they probably consumed a lot of your content, and they understood. Okay,
true, but
we share ideas.
True, but I'll tell you something. I've worked with a lot of, and I've been on the road with mainstream journalists in Syria, in Iraq, in other places, and the caliber of journalists at RT is very high, and the professionalism and the fact checking very high, more than a lot of Western mainstream media. They actually do fact checking, and they shy away from narratives. And we see some of the crazy stories in the New York Times, like this mass rape story that with October 7th.
Yes.
That wouldn't fly in a Russian media outlet. They would want to know the provenance of it. Oh, how can it be proven? Have to double check it. We can't run with that yet. So Press TV, CGTN, so there's all these English language international media outlets appeared around 2006, 2007. And that's when these countries realized to protect themselves or to advance their viewpoint globally, they need to communicate in English. Telesur in Venezuela, another one. These are all very successful media ventures. TRT in Turkey, maybe not as successful maybe as RT and Press TV and the others, and Telesur, but you can see the trend. The trend was they realized the lingua franca for the second language of the world is English, and we need to be in that conversation.
I'd like to ask two more questions. One will be about your career, and the other will be about the United States and the declining empire, I guess you could say. So I was reading your bio online, and I saw that you are self-taught. So you didn't study journalism officially,
no.
Yet you've done incredible work. And I've noticed there's some of the best journalists in the game also did not go to these institutional centers for studying journalism. And so as a result, they can think for themselves. So I'd like to hear from you. How did you get into journalism, and what was that process like? What's your guiding philosophy, I guess, for investigating and reporting?
I got into it very late. So, and probably the two issues that really kind of red-pilled me, you could say, about what's going on in the world. One of them was definitely late 90s, Second Intifada in Palestine. And I was living in a Palestinian community at the time. And so they kind of got me up to speed on this, and I was really, oh my gosh, I didn't understand or know any of this. And it kind of realized there's a world behind the mainstream media, and you got to go and find out what's going on there. And then you become a political activist or a peace activist. We're out on the street trying to stop the Iraq War in 2003 in London. And, at some point, you realize, the Iraq War was a big moment. 9/11 was quite a major event as well, but in a different way. But the Iraq War was big in this way, because 2 million people in London and all around the world, millions more, took to the streets, and it didn't stop the U.S. and Britain from going in and doing what they did. And that created a lot of disappointment and despondency among the anti-war activists, a sense of defeat. But so many people I know who launched independent media outlets and independent journalists, bloggers, they were motivated from that frustration. Then they decided, I've got to do more. We got to communicate more. We have to take advantage of the tools we have. And blogging was just blogging was used to promote the Iraq War very cleverly. Mainstream writers who were just starting to blog were capturing that space. They called them the pro-war left, and especially out of the UK, people writing for The Guardian, The Independent. And then a lot of us sort of, what can we do? Well, that's one thing we do. I taught myself how to write. You could say my first degree was in art and design, so I was, more of a right brain thinker. I did take philosophy, though, at Cal Poly. I took a lot of philosophy curriculum because I was interested in that. It was good grounding. But I had to learn how to write, and it's a trial and error process. I'm still learning how to write, actually. And it's a lifetime thing. You can never finish it. It's an ongoing process. So I did a lot of free blogging sites, and I was doing well and getting upvoted and stuff. This is in 2005, 6, 7, 8. And then I started writing for other websites, bigger websites like Global Research, Infowars.com, and other independent media outlets, and then internet radio stations that come on and talk to us about what's going on in Libya or what's going on in Iraq and so forth, what's going on in Palestine. And so I started doing that, and then after a while got frustrated with submitting articles, so I decided started a WordPress site with the help of some friends and family, and then I became my own editor at that point and built that up into a fully functional media platform with written video and audio. We have a successful podcast live radio show we've done live from 2013. It's called The Sunday Wire, every week, almost every week since then. And that was good to kind of generate engagement. And I think it's really important to have a podcast or do something on a regular basis if you have written content that people can use as a rallying point at least once a week or something like that.
Right.
A lot of sacrifice, a lot of work, no money, barely hanging on, getting pelted by censorship and demonetization and all the rest of it. It's not a career you want to get into if you want to earn a living. So it's not. And it's funny. I applied for journalism school because I wanted to, after a few years, to do a master's degree in journalism from one of the top schools in America, and I was rejected. My application was rejected, probably because they looked at my work, and I didn't realize how extreme maybe the politics were. And this would have been 2015, 2016. And another great journalist in the Middle East, actually, she encouraged me to study international relations. She said, "Why are you going to do journalism?" I thought, oh, maybe I could teach one day or something. I needed a master's degree. She said, "No, study international relations." So I did apply to do an IR degree, master's degree at Plymouth in the UK, and that was a humbling experience. I thought I knew a lot, and I did know a lot, but I was a bit overconfident, and I was forced back into academia, and it's a big leveler. I had to read a lot of texts and learn realism, learn Mearsheimer, learn liberal internationalism, learn UN language, globalist language, you could say, so that I can make those counter arguments. That was hard. That nearly, that takes a physical toll on you. But in the end, I'm still benefiting from that. So I went back into politics. So I was told it's better, we need more international relations experts who do journalism rather than people who study journalism and dabble in international relations. So interesting kind of approach, but I'm glad I did it because it's opened up a lot of intellectual doors for me.
I think we have something in common in that regard. I haven't done as much work as you have. I hope to one day. But I did not go to school for filmmaking. I did not study journalism. In fact, I kind of take issue with people referring to me as a journalist because I tell them I'm not a journalist. I feel like it's disrespectful to journalists to call me a journalist. I don't operate as such. I joke, I call myself a propagandist. But the reason why is because, I sometimes don't care about some of the rules. I'm not saying I lie or anything like that. No, of course not. But, I want to have some more freedom, and I don't want to be tied by the this is going to sound bad, by, I guess, the values of journalism. I'm very straightforward about the fact that I'm a propagandist and propagating my own interpretation of how I see the world, and I would much rather be viewed that way. But
do you hear people say, "Oh, why don't you do both sides of the issue?" You get that a lot, don't you? How come you're not showing the other side of the issue? Because this is the mainstream charter,
Right.
which is we need to give equal time.
Yeah.
And my attitude, you probably have had to fight this one off, is that why should I give you the Israeli position because you've got that 24/7 on
Exactly.
CNN,
Yeah, exactly.
365, and on Fox and everything else. So so you're kind of like us in the sense that a small independent media operation. We're not we're not like an armada. We're just one battleship, but we're able to do something that the mainstream isn't able to do. When there's an event or a crisis, we're able to move our little battleship and point our guns in one direction and just keep firing on one target.
That's an excellent way to put it.
And believe me, we have changed the narrative collectively. A lot of little battleships, like in Star Wars, the Rebel Alliance, that ragtag fleet, that they blew up the Death Star, defeated the Empire. I mean, you can do that in independent media. You don't need orders from headquarters either.
Right.
You know what to do. We know what to do, which is the instinct is, and because you didn't go to journalism school, maybe, or I didn't, is we have the instinct because we know where the narrative weak point is. We see the hypocrisy, we see the self contradictions in the narrative, and that's where you point your guns and you fire truth through that door. And eventually, if you keep doing that consistently, you will weaken, you'll create enough doubt across the conversation on social media, and if everyone does that collectively, and this is why we are winning in this battle of the narrative against the mainstream media, because they institutionally can't do it. They can't do that. They have too many interests and too much at stake.
Right, exactly. I feel like our work is kind of made easy for us because the facts, in most cases are usually on our side. And so if you're just shining a light on that, which is almost, I guess objectively true, it's a lot easier. I want to ask you this last question before we wrap up. I think we've been going for about 2 hours now. The U.S. empire, you've described it as declining. I think many people agree with that. We're definitely past its prime. It feels like we have been on the cusp of a major economic collapse like we saw in 2007, 2008. But it hasn't happened yet by some, I don't want to say a miracle because they've been playing, some games with the Fed, trying to prevent this. Do you think an economic crash is on the horizon? Is it inevitable? And where do you see the U.S. empire going as a whole?
I think a lot of financial pundits will say this and have said it, that any fiat money system is destined to collapse eventually. Just look at the value of the dollar from 1900, before the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, and you look at the value of the dollar now in relative terms. It's it's practically worthless, and this is just going to continue. And but why it's different now than in even the Roman Empire days or various other. The British Empire had sterling as the world reserve currency. The U.S. dollar is different, and so when we're talking about the U.S. empire, coincidentally, this is what I did my master's thesis on, which was the weaponization of sanctions and the decline of U.S. power. When you look at an empire, what gives the U.S. its power isn't its military. It's its financial power. It's a financial preponderance, not military preponderance. The military backs up the financial power. That's the difference. And so what the U.S. has that the British didn't have, that the Russians didn't have, or the Russian Empire or the Roman Empire, all the different empires throughout history in different parts of the world, this idea of the dollar as a world reserve currency is kind of a genius coup d'etat for the world, because by having a debt-based currency, fiat fractional reserve debt-based currency, and moving that to where global commodities are mandated to be purchased and denominated in dollar value, and then forcing, in a way, countries to hold dollar reserves, that helps to inflate and stabilize the value of the dollar globally. And by doing this, the U.S. is able to do something that no other power in the world is able to do, and that is deficit spending. The deficit spending creates the $1.2 trillion military budget and all of the other domestic things that the U.S. needs to pay for. Right now, the deficit spending is at astronomical levels, trillions of dollars per year. What the U.S. government takes in revenue is pretty much shot before the 6-month mark. Everything else is borrowed or it's deficit spending. We project power through deficit spending. That pays for our military. It pays for our bases, 1,000 plus bases around the world. It's deficit spending. And that can only be done if you have a global reserve currency. And you maintain that by gamifying oil, gas, commodities, markets, and making sure that the dollar is the most liquid form of exchange on the planet. But that reserve currency status is reducing. Not super fast, but gradually. And as countries opt to move out of the dollar for fear of having their assets frozen through sanctions and so forth, and for good reason, Russia, Iran, China, and everyone else who's got dollar-denominated assets and keeping dollars in reserve, they're now thinking, whoa, even India might be sanctioned by the United States for buying Russian oil. They're all having to rethink this. Do we really need to use the dollar as a reserve liquid form of exchange? And the minute they're not using those dollars and those reserves are empty, they come back to the United States, and that fuels inflation. It's more complicated than that, but I'm just giving a simple, basic explanation. And we're seeing inflation now in the United States that it's really being underreported. I mean, just coming in and out of the country in the last 5 years, I'm shocked. Just the last 5 years, basic costs of things, it's unbelievably high. In fact, I saw a statistic that said, in relative terms, today there's more inflation in the U.S. than in Venezuela.
Wow.
Today. So that's how bad it is here, and a lot of it is being kind of suppressed. And that's the kind of stealth tax, as Ron Paul would say, that robs you of your savings and the value of the money you have in your pocket. But that's the price you pay for empire. It's in inflation. And throughout history, empires have collapsed for that reason, eventually. Now, it's not going to collapse maybe as rapidly as some people might think, or even some would like, because the dollar is still the number one game in town in terms of liquidity, in terms of arbitrage, in terms of currency pairing and so forth. So this isn't going to happen overnight, but you're starting, if you're looking at it as a trajectory, the U.S. is on the way down. Hence, you're starting to see a panic in the political class and the elite class saying, China is our competitor and they mean us harm, and we need to disrupt China because China wants to take over the global economy, and Russia and so forth. So the U.S. is creating more boogeymen, rhetorically anyway, and people that we need to basically stop so they don't confront or challenge our hegemony. But the reality is that ship has already left port. The U.S. hegemony is on a decline, and it can't be reversed. There's nothing it can do to change that, because this is just the arc of history that Eurasia and China and many other states around the world are rising, have technology, have resources, are developing things, have strategic advantages economically in terms of labor and all sorts of other things, human capital. Iran is a good example. How's Iran been able to rise as a regional superpower in the Middle East? Through advances in missile technology, avionics, aeronautical engineering. Where did they get that? Did they import that from the U.S., nuclear power? No, it was all homegrown. Even under sanctions, their human capital, in terms of how many PhDs they produce, female PhDs in engineering, for instance, they're doing that domestically. So other countries are doing the same. Brazil, number of other Asian countries, India. There's all sorts of locations around the world that are no longer in a kind of colonial mode. And so this means that the era of U.S. unfettered dominance is over. So what's it going to do? What's the mission of the empire? If it doesn't control the global system, what's the mission? What's the raison d'etat? The reason for the state, their main mission? Is it to, if it's not to rule the world, is it to then disrupt? Is it to sabotage? Is it to break the Belt and Road project rather than construct an alternative to it that makes sense and that's a win-win? Now, from the Western hegemonic viewpoint, doesn't believe in win-win anymore. It's now, maybe it never did, but everything becomes a zero-sum game. That any benefit China or anything advantage China gets is a disadvantage for us. We lose if China wins. We lose if Russia wins. We lose if Iran wins. We lose if India wins, or who knows what other countries you can fill in the blanks. And so that zero-sum game thinking is, I think, the prelude to conflict. And if that's the way they're going to view the world, then there's a major kind of reckoning that needs to happen in the U.S. What is the national mission? What is the purpose of the state? Is it just to be number one? Or is it to provide better products and solutions for the world? What can it export to the world other than military dominance and what else? Dollars, U.S. reserve currency, U.S. products, and so forth. So can the U.S. get used to or acclimate itself to a new position in a multipolar world or not? Or the powers that be in the Anglo-American sphere, is their answer to that going to be to blow up the multipolar system and to escalate a world war to then have order out of chaos and reestablish dominance by destroying half of China and Russia? Is that the raison d'etat? Is that the mission of the empire? It's hard to know the answer to that when you hear some of these people talking publicly in Washington, some of the crazy things that have been said, and they're being said right now. It's hard to know the answer to that question. But you ask that question maybe during the Second World War, after the Second World War, and there was a kind of mission. We want to have world peace, and we want to defeat the Soviet Union and communism. That was the mission of America for 70 years. And so now, what is the mission? And this is a civilizational question. America's blessed because it has two
massive oceans,
relatively friendly neighbors to the north and the south. Russia can't boast those sort of endowments. They have not even a mountain range between Russia and Europe. And so their history, their geography has shaped the national character through the battles and the invasions over the years. And it's shaped their reason, their raison d'etat. And likewise, the U.S. hasn't had that challenge. It's a colonial settler country that then established dominion over North America and then expanded to establish dominion globally through an empire backed by the U.S. dollar. When that day ends, or when that is in its demise phase, what then? It has to come up with a reason other than just waging war against everybody else or stopping China or something. But I think you need some imagination. There's a lack of imagination in Washington. They cannot visualize anything past these tropes and sound bites, and they just think, well, we've got these weapons, we've got this military, we've got all this money, we've got bases around the world, we need to kick ass. And that becomes the raison d'etat. So this is a problem, you know. Civilizations rise and fall on these very questions. And the U.S. is very unique on the planet Earth because of its disposition. Physically, the U.S. could they could cause a global economic crash, pull its drawbridges up, wait it out with all of our oil reserves and energy reserves, and then go up and sweep up the dust of the disaster afterwards. It could start World War III and then retreat and then go back and clean it up, as it did with the Marshall Plan in World War II, after World War II, and come up with another system, financial system.
Do we have the factories to do so, though?
No, there would have to be a retooling, and but the U.S. could survive, has enough of an industrial base in this hemisphere, with Mexico and other countries, that it could weather a global apocalypse, as it were. So
it's a scary thought.
It could, and
they could cause it and retreat, like you said, and be totally fine.
Let's be realistic. There's people making those calculations in think tanks like the Rand Corporation or others. And this is so they did this during the Cold War. They do these same exercises. They have computer simulations about war and collapse of economies and so forth. I hope that doesn't happen, of course, but you know, this is something we have to kind of consider. How's that going to play out? It's a good question. It's a difficult question. It's one that nobody really wants to talk about.
Right. Well, Patrick, I appreciate having you here. It was a wonderful conversation. I think our audience is really going to enjoy and benefit from that. We're going to link in the description of this video 21st Century and any other
21st Century Wire.
21st Century Wire. If there are any other links that you'd like us to put in there, we can do that so people can check out your work, learn more about your story, your career, and support the important journalism that you're doing. Thank you for being here, and I hope to do it again sometime.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Trust nothing.